In 1899, men went missing along Shaw Creek in Missouri. The Barlow sisters, who were herbalists living in the woods, had a dark secret. They thought that ritual torture was the only way to get men's life force. For many years, they worked without anyone knowing until Sheriff Hayes found their secret root cellar. How did this horrible thing keep happening in a close-knit community? What strange beliefs made them do what they did? Sign up to learn about hidden histories and leave a comment with your location below. In the last years of the 19th century, the Missouri Ozarks were a world of their own. The landscape was so remote and harsh that it seemed to be outside of modern civilization's reach. The hollows were very deep between the limestone ridges. The floors were so full of oak and hickory that even in the middle of the day, sunlight had a hard time getting through the canopy. Streams, like Shaw Creek, snaked through Newton County, their banks covered in blackberry thickets and wild grapevines that made natural barriers between one family's land and the next. This was a place where a man could walk for hours without seeing another person. The sound of his own footsteps on the leaves might be the only human noise for miles. People in these hills lived in small, closed-off communities that were very wary of outsiders. The same families had lived on the same plots of land for generations, and their names could be found on deed records that went back to the days of the territory. They spoke the language of their Scots-Irish ancestors, followed traditions from Appalachian hollows farther east, and settled their differences without going to court or calling the sheriff. When the law did come, it came on horseback and was only allowed when it was absolutely necessary. People knew the Barlow sisters in this small world, but they didn't really understand them. Elizabeth and Macabre lived in a cabin that their family had owned for almost 100 years. It was on a hilltop overlooking Shaw Creek, in a hollow so far away that even the most daring peddlers thought twice before going down the overgrown trail to their door. People who lived within a few miles of them knew them as herbalists and hunters. They would come to the nearest settlement maybe twice a year to trade venison and medicinal plants for salt, ammo, and other things they needed but couldn't make themselves. It was strange how they always had the same dark braids and finished each other's sentences when they did talk. But being strange wasn't a crime in the Ozarks, where being different was often the only way to stay alive in such a harsh place. The sisters stayed to themselves and didn't hurt anyone that anyone could see. That was enough for their neighbors to leave them alone. The first person to go missing, which would eventually lead to the Barlow cabin, did so in the fall of 1897. Silas Kane was a traveling peddler. He was a man in his late 42s who had seen a lot of life and made his living moving from settlement to settlement with a horse-drawn cart full of needles, thread, patented medicines, and small luxuries that families who lived alone couldn't get any other way. People in Newton County knew him well because of his old brown hat and the smell of tobacco that always hung around him. He left the town of Neosho on a cool October morning with a full cart and said he would be back within a week. After 3 weeks without hearing from him, a few people noticed he was gone and were a little worried, but not much more than that. Peddlers were known to be unreliable because they would change their routes on a whim or stay longer in areas where they could make more money. Questions didn't start to come up until a farmer found Kane's empty cart by Shaw Creek. The cart had been turned over, and its contents were spread out across the creek bank, as if there had been a fight or a sudden panic. The horse was gone, and so was Kane. The local constable looked around the area, saw that there was no blood or clear signs of violence, and decided that robbers had probably attacked Kane, taken his horse, and left him to walk home. He might have hurt himself and crawled into the woods to die, or he might have just walked away from his ruined life and started over somewhere else. Either way, Silas Kane became just another number in the long list of men who disappeared in the wild. No one had the time or resources to figure out what happened to him. Sheriff Callan Hayes took office in Newton County in January 1899. He was a controversial choice among the locals because he was an outsider and had a military background. They wanted their law enforcement to know the unwritten rules of mountain justice. Hayes was a veteran of the Civil War and a former Union officer who moved to Missouri after the war because the land was cheap and he wanted a quiet retirement. He didn't like retirement, so when the sheriff's job came open, he ran on a platform of fair, methodical law enforcement that would treat everyone the same no matter what their last name was or how long their family had lived in the county. It was a message that resonated in the larger towns, but met with cool reception in the remote hollows, where families had been settling their own affairs for generations without interference from badge-wearing strangers. Hayes understood why people were against him, but he also knew that it was his duty to seek justice even when it was hard. Hayes's first big test came in the spring of 1899. Thomas Garrett, a young man who was the nephew of one of the county's oldest farming families, didn't come back from a hunting trip along Shaw Creek. People barely noticed when Silas Kane went missing 2 years ago, but Thomas Garrett's absence sent shockwaves through the community. He was 23 years old, strong, and capable. He was known for being good with a rifle and knowing the area well. He had left his uncle's farm on a clear April morning with enough food for 3 days. He planned to hunt turkey in the hills near the creek. Search parties were sent out when a week went by without him coming back. They found his camp just as he had left it, with his bedroll and supplies untouched. But Thomas was gone, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Hayes's family wanted him to do something, and he felt a lot of pressure to get results in a case where there were no witnesses, no clear crime scene, and no body. The only way Hayes knew how to start his investigation was with patience and a lot of questions. He rode from cabin to cabin all spring and summer, and when he got there, people often didn't say anything and gave him suspicious looks. At each stop, he asked the same questions. Has anyone seen Thomas Garrett? Has anyone noticed strangers in the area? Has anyone heard strange noises or seen anything strange? The answers were all useless. Mountain families didn't tell on their neighbors, and they definitely didn't give information to a police officer they barely knew. Hayes had a feeling that the families were only answering his questions in the most basic way possible, giving him only the bare minimum of what was polite and holding back anything that might point the finger at someone they knew. He couldn't break through the wall of silence by just asking questions. Hayes started to see patterns in the older records as the months went by. He spent long nights in the county courthouse going over reports filed by people who had worked there before him. Most of them were just short notes about missing persons cases that had been closed without finding the person. He found records of 3 other men who had gone missing near Shaw Creek in the last 4 years, a logger from a transient camp in 1898, an itinerant preacher in early 1897, and, of course, Silas Kane later that same year. In each case, the police said it was an accident, a robbery, or a man just moving on without telling anyone. But Hayes saw something that his predecessors had not. All 4 men had last been seen walking along the same 20-mile stretch of trail that went through the hollow where the Barlow sisters lived in their family's cabin. Hayes knew that the pattern he had found didn't prove anything, and that going to see the Barlow sisters without a good reason would only make the community trust him less. He needed something real, like a physical connection between the missing men and the cabin on the hill above Shaw Creek. During the summer of 1899, he went back to each place where someone had gone missing to look for anything his predecessors might have missed in their quick checks. He didn't find anything. The forest had taken back the scenes, covering up any signs of life with new growth and fallen leaves, erasing footprints, and scattering anything that might have been left behind. By August, the case had gone cold, and the pressure on Hayes from Thomas Garrett's family had changed from urgent demands to bitter acceptance. The young man's uncle stopped talking to the sheriff altogether because he thought Hayes was either incompetent or unwilling to seek justice in the lawless hollows where his own authority didn't mean anything. A 4-year-old boy looking for squirrels broke the case open that September. The boy, whose name is only listed in court records as J. Calloway, was the son of a family that had lived along Shaw Creek for 3 generations. He knew every twist and turn of the stream, every game trail through the thicket, and every rocky outcropping where squirrels made their homes in the heat of late summer. On a hot and humid afternoon, he was walking along the creek bank near where Silas Kane's cart had been found 2 years earlier when he saw something in a patch of dried mud. It was small and pale, and it was half buried in the sediment. Its carved surface reflected the afternoon light in a way that natural objects did not. The boy used his fingers to dig it out and found a button about the size of a silver dollar that looked like it was made of bone. There was a complicated pattern of spirals and symbols on the surface that he didn't know what they meant, It was clearly the work of someone who was very skilled and patient. The boy knew it was strange and maybe valuable, so he took it home to show his dad. Jay Calloway's dad knew right away that this was not the kind of thing that could be found by accident in creek mud. It was too nice and too carefully made to have been thrown away carelessly. He also thought it might have something to do with the missing peddler, whose cart had been found in almost the same place. Even though the mountain code said not to work with outside law, the elder Calloway made the hard choice to give the button to Sheriff Hayes. Maybe he did it because he thought that even a traveling peddler deserved better than to disappear without anyone caring enough to find out why. Hayes looked at the button with more and more excitement, turning it over in his hands and looking at the carved patterns. He had seen carvings like this before, but it took him a moment to remember where. The memory came back to him with a cold certainty that changed everything. He had seen those same spiraling symbols carved into the doorframe and window shutters of the Barlow cabin when he visited months earlier. He had thought they were strange decorations, but hadn't thought they were connected to anything criminal. Hayes now had a physical object that connected one of the missing men to a place near the Barlow property. He had also seen similar art at the sister's house. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was enough to look more closely into the family's past. For the next 2 weeks, he worked in the county records office, going through every document that had anything to do with the Barlow name. What he found deeply disturbed him. The family had lived in that same hollow for almost 100 years, with a matriarchal line of women living alone or with sisters. When the family men did show up in records, they died young or just stopped being recorded after a certain point. In early October 1899, Hayes asked the county judge for a search warrant. He had the carved button and the strange pattern he had found in the family records. The request was controversial, and he had to convince a skeptical magistrate that circumstantial evidence and historical anomalies made it okay to invade the homes of 2 women. The judge knew that allowing the search would have political consequences, so he thought about it for 3 days before finally giving Hayes the warrant, with clear instructions to act with restraint and dignity. On a cold morning in mid-October, Sheriff Hayes and 2 deputies, both men he had chosen for their calmness and ability to keep secrets, arrived at the Barlow cabin. The cabin was in its usual spot, with a thin gray line of smoke rising from the chimney and disappearing into the cloudy sky. As the 3 police officers got off their horses and walked up to the old building, the front door opened before they could knock. Elizabeth Barlow stepped out onto the porch with a calm look of curiosity, as if she had been waiting for them. Hayes showed them the warrant and said that they were going to search the place because of a few missing persons cases. Elizabeth listened without saying a word, and when he was done, she simply stepped aside and waved them in. Maeve stood in the doorway behind her sister, just as calm, with her hands still covered in flour from whatever she had been making before they got there. The 2 women didn't fight back or complain about their rights or ask what crime they were being accused of. They just watched with mild interest as the 3 men started their search, as if they were watching a mildly interesting show that had nothing to do with them. The inside of the cabin was simple and very well organized. The kitchen, living room, and bedroom were all in one room. There were 2 narrow cots against one wall, and a stone fireplace in the middle of the room. There were shelves on the walls that held jars of preserved vegetables, bundles of dried herbs, and other tools for everyday life. Hayes looked at everything carefully, looking for anything that could link the sisters to the men who were missing. One of his deputies saw the coat hanging on a peg near the door. It was a man's coat made of heavy wool and was way too big for either of the sisters. Hayes took it down and looked at it closely. His heart raced when he saw that the coat had a row of unique bone buttons down the front, each carved with the same spiral pattern as the button he found by the creek. But there was no button in the 3rd position, only loose threads where it had been attached. Finding the coat gave Hayes a legal reason to look for more than just the main room. Hayes saw something that didn't seem right in the otherwise old and worn cabin as the deputies kept looking through its contents. A section of floorboards in the corner farthest from the fireplace looked newer than the rest. The wood still had some of its original color, while the planks around it had darkened over the years from use and dirt. He called one of his deputies over, and they both pulled up the boards to find a small hole that led down into the dark. The smell that came up from below was immediate and unmistakable, a mix of chemicals, decay, and damp earth that hinted at things that shouldn't be there. Hayes lit a lantern and went down into what turned out to be a hidden root cellar. It was about 10 feet square and had been dug out of the hillside under the cabin's foundation. Sheriff Hayes would never forget what he found in that root cellar. The wooden supports on the earthen walls had been strengthened, and iron restraints were bolted to those supports. The iron restraints were rusty and had things on them that he didn't want to name. Along one wall, there were rough shelves with personal items on them, like a pocket watch, a leather Bible with gold edges, and a collection of men's personal items that were clearly from different people. Strange tools hung from hooks driven into the support beams. They looked like they were made for things Hayes could only begin to imagine with growing horror. There was a locked wooden chest in the corner with the same spiraling symbols on its surface as the cabin above. Hayes used a pry bar to break the lock and opened it to find a bunch of leather-bound journals. There were cramped letters on their pages that told the story of decades of systematic horror. The oldest entries were from the 1,860 and were written in a different hand than the newer ones. This suggests that this practice had been passed down through generations of Barlow women, like a twisted inheritance. Hayes took the sisters into custody right away. They didn't fight back and looked almost happy that their secret had finally been found out. They were taken to the county jail in Neosho, where they were held until their trial. Hayes and his deputies searched the area around the cabin thoroughly, and, with the help of information from the journals, they found 5 shallow graves in the hollow. Each one held the body of a man who had been missing for 4 years. The journals say that the bodies were buried in a very specific way that the sisters believed in, with certain orientations and depths. Personal items and, in some cases, dental records were used to identify the victims. Silas Kane, the peddler, Marcus Webb, the itinerant preacher, 2 loggers from transient camps, whose names were later confirmed through employer records, and Thomas Garrett, the young farmer whose disappearance had led Hayes to start looking into the case. The trial started in February 1900 and became a big deal that drew reporters from as far away as St. Louis and Kansas City. Every day, the courtroom was full of people who wanted to see what many thought was the most disturbing criminal case in Missouri's history. The prosecution used the journals as evidence and read parts that showed how the sisters thought and how they went about what they called their sacred duty. Elizabeth Barlow took the stand to explain the charges against her, not to deny them. In a calm, measured voice, she talked for more than 3 hours about how their grandmother had taught their mother, and their mother had taught them, that women were the true vessels of life, and that men were only temporary conduits of vital energy that needed to be collected and returned to the earth to keep the matriarchal line going. She told them how they would find the right men, who would always be travelers who wouldn't be missed, and how they would get them to come to the cabin by promising them shelter or medical help. She talked about the rituals they did and the mental and sexual torture they thought was necessary to clean the body before the final sacrifice, all in a way that sounded like she was explaining how to preserve vegetables or tan leather. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a decision and found the defendant guilty on all counts. In that time period, Missouri rarely executed women, so both sisters were given life sentences at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. Elizabeth died of tuberculosis in 1910, but she kept her beliefs until the end. Macabre lived until 1941. She spent more than 40 years in prison and never showed any remorse or admitted that what she did was murder instead of a sacred duty. Residents of the area burned down the Barlow cabin within a year of the trial in the hopes of getting rid of its dark past. Today, only the stone foundation is left. The forest is slowly taking it back, a silent reminder of the men who died there and the twisted faith that drove them to it. The feral Gable sisters' twisted sexual rituals.